So this hearing is on U.S. policy after Russia's escalation in Syria. Nearly 5 years into the Syrian conflict, that conflict has claimed more than 250,000 lives. There are 14 million people right now that have been driven from their homes in Syria. Now, through it all, the administration's response has been tepid. It has been ineffectual. And when I say ineffectual, we had a situation here where we had hearings during the time, a 1-year period, in which, as ISIS began to move out of Raqqa, Syria, during that period of time, as we were calling for airstrikes, as our ambassador in Baghdad was calling for airstrikes, there were 14 major cities that fell to ISIS. Fell at a time when in pickup trucks on an open desert road, these were cleared targets that could have been taken out. But a choice was made. Sometimes indecision, the decision not to make a decision is itself a choice. The choice was made in the United States not to stop ISIS then when it could have been stopped. And the choice was also made not to arm the Kurds. 3 trips out here by the foreign minister of Kurdistan asking for the anti-tank weapons, the artillery, the long-range mortars that they needed. 30% of their troops, 30% of their brigades are women, females, fighting on the front lines against ISIS on a 600-mile front. And the decision was made not to arm them. So ISIS now stands where it stands, gaining ground as a result of our failure to act. Today, the President still hasn't put forward the broad, overarching strategy needed to defeat this brutal movement, this movement of terrorists, and frankly, to secure vital U.S. national security interests here. But instead, it is now Russia that is taking the decisive role in shaping Syria's future, and not in a helpful way. Putin saw Assad losing ground, so Russian jets have teamed up with Iranian ground forces to solidify the Syrian dictator. And the focus of the Russians and Iranians' joint offensive is not ISIS. It is not their strongholds, but it is the opposition forces backed by the United States and Saudi Arabia. Russian bombs, according to the NGO groups that report on this, and they say over half of the Russian attacks have now been on civilian targets. Russian bombs have flattened markets, schools, villages. And the Russians, at one point, were bombing more targets in one solitary day than we hit in a month. And our air campaign there is even more anemic, for those of you that have followed what has happened as a consequence of Russia moving in to these operations. The administration claims that it lacks targets, yet the special forces it is sending to Syria won't even be spotting targets. Russian attacks on the opposition and the slowdown in coalition airstrikes has actually allowed ISIS now to gain territory. ISIS is expanding. Let no one be under the delusion that Russia is focused on ISIS. While the President characterizes Russia's moves as a sign of weakness, it is Assad who is growing stronger. Moscow's efforts show no sign of slowing. Russian cargo aircraft have been seen running Iranian weapons into Syria, a violation of the UN arms embargo, a violation that I assume is not going to be called to attention or challenged. But it is a clear violation of that agreement at the United Nations. And this is especially troubling as we begin another attempt to restart talks between the regime and the opposition on a new constitution and elections. And here is why. Russia claims its goal is a united, secular, and democratic Syria, but its efforts to prop up the Assad regime prove otherwise. How do we expect the opposition to sign on to any sort of ceasefire as long as Russia and Iran are demanding that Assad, who has murdered over 200,000 civilians? For those of us in this hearing room, we have heard in the past Caesar come forward with his photographs that he took, 50,000 photographs of people tortured by the regime. That kind of conduct by this regime means it's lost all legitimacy with the Syrian people. So the Russian plan is to have him stay in power and to ask at the outset that he stays in power. The statement from Vienna didn't even demand that the Assad regime stop using crude barrel bombs, some filled with chlorine gas, against civilians. That would have been a minimum step that the Russians could have supported. But their planes, they provided the Air Force originally to Assad. So a diplomatic solution is only possible with a strong, coherent, moderate opposition that can serve as a bridge from Assad to a new post-conflict government. Yet the administration has done little to help the opposition. Its feeble train and equip program is now defunct. Washington bureaucracy and over-deference to the Shia-led Iraqi government has held up desperately needed weapons shipments to the Kurds. And no one believes Friday's announcement of 50 special forces will be decisive. Ultimately, it is President Obama's responsibility to step up and outline a plan to engage our partners and allies and bring stability to the Middle East. He is the commander-in-chief, but here is where I'd start. As I've already said, we've urged for the longest time decisive airstrikes against ISIS. We've urged for the longest time the arming of the Kurdish and Yazidi men and women out there on the front lines with the weapons they need to turn back ISIS. If we want an opposition to negotiate from a position of strength, why not help create sanctuary areas in Syria? This would help the Syrian people escape both the Assad regime and the Islamic State. This would also allow for more effective humanitarian relief and even slow the exodus of refugees. We must also push back on Russia and Iran's destabilizing intervention in this conflict. And that means passing tough new sanctions on Iran's terrorist proxy, Hezbollah, because it's Hezbollah that is taking over homes in this region that used to be inhabited by Sunnis as the ethnic cleansing continues. So we need to pass that legislation, as the House has done, and take action to uphold the UN arms embargo on Iran in the face of Russian violations. Everyone but the White House seems to know the status quo cannot stand. General David Petraeus recently testified to Congress that Syria is a geopolitical Chernobyl. And like a nuclear disaster, the fallout from the meltdown of Syria threatens to be with us for decades, he said. And the longer it is permitted to continue, the more severe the damage will be.